Dear friends, we have this session on responding to contemporary crisis, resources from the tradition by Charles C. Curran. So it's a great privilege for me to chair this session and to introduce Father Charles C. Curran, one of the most well-known moral theologians of the world. He is the Elizabeth Sherlock University Professor of Human Values at Southern Methodist University, Dallas, USA. He has authored and edited more than 50 books in the area of moral theology. One of the latest of them is Tradition and Church Reform, Perspectives on Catholic Moral Teaching, published in 2016. Besides, the 18-volume series of Readings in Moral Theology from Paulist Press, which he has co-edited, is a rich resource for moral theology. Father Curran has served as president of 3 national professional societies, the American Theological Society, the Catholic Theological Society of America, and the Society of Christian Ethics, and has won various prestigious awards. Father Curran is acknowledged by all as a theologian of clear thoughts and bold stances, who beautifully integrates traditional resources and signs of the times, and a theologian of creative fidelity. Father Curran will help us understand more profoundly how resources from the tradition can assist us to respond to the contemporary crisis. As you might have noticed, this session is an exception to the rule of 15 minutes presentation. Father Curran will speak for about 40 minutes, which will be followed by 20 to 25 minutes of discussion. Dear friends, over to Father Charles C. Curran.
Thank you very much, Shaji. It's a pleasure to be here. I came under the one condition that I could dissent from the rule of 15 minutes and have more time. But I'm really not too sure what an old-timer like me can contribute to your discourse. But if you find it helpful, then use it. So that in this significant conference, all right. In this significant conference, we're talking about contemporary moral problems we are facing in the world today, such as corruption, ecological devastation, and climate change. My charge from the committee is to develop what the Catholic moral tradition has to say about these and similar problems. I will often refer to these problems with the broader phrase of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. And I propose that the Catholic tradition at its best, not its worst, at its best, has 3 important considerations that bear on dealing with these moral problems we face in the global world today. First, it is not enough just to determine what actions are just or right. There's a need to make what is right and what is just more present in the world in which we live. Secondly, the consideration of the morality of acts alone is not enough. We also have to consider the person. Third, but in addition to the person, there are many other moral actors, both personally and somewhat collectively. And I think the Roman Catholic tradition of subsidiarity will help us to fill out those other actors. So those are the 3 points. The first is determining what is right or wrong is not enough. Catholic moral theology should be understood not only as determining whether acts are right or wrong, but also with the need to bring about change so that what is true, justice, and right becomes more present in the world in which we live. In this aspect, Catholic moral theology differs somewhat from moral philosophy or moral ideas. That's primarily interested in the ideas of what is right or wrong. Take, for example, the case of bribery. That's an important part of the broader issue of corruption and is present in all parts of the global society today. A bribe is an inducement influencing the performance of a public function meant to be gratuitously exercised. The late John T. Noonan Jr. years ago published an exhaustive 839-page treatise, Bribes, the Intellectual History of a Moral Idea. The title very accurately summarizes how Noonan deals with the issue. He's talking just about moral ideals. His concluding chapter discusses the future of the bribe. Noonan concludes that 4 reasons will ultimately continue to make sure that bribes are morally condemned. First, bribing is universally shameful. Second, bribery is a sellout to the rich. Third, bribery is a betrayal of trust. And fourth, bribery violates the divine precept of Deuteronomy 10, maintaining that God does not take bribes. But that's in the realm of ideas. And despite Noonan's magnificent work, there's as much bribery in the world today as there was when he wrote that. So the Catholic tradition itself, unfortunately, has not always recognized the need to go beyond the ideas of what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust. For example, the manuals of moral theology have the narrow scope of declaring which acts are sinful and the degree of sinfulness. They express no interest whatsoever in how to change practices such as corruption or bribery. All you had to do was point out what the law of God said, and that took care of it. However, to its credit, Catholic social teaching and ethics, by its very nature, aims at making justice more present in our society. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, the International Synod of Bishops in 1971, made these points very clearly. Action on behalf of justice, and the participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the Church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. Liberation theology recognized the need to free people from social, political, and economic oppression and proposed the way, the means to bring this about. The emphasis on sinful structures calls for Christians to work concretely to change and eliminate this structural sin. Catholic social ethics involves not only orthodoxy, but also orthopraxis. The Catholic tradition thus has to be concerned with the concrete ways of overcoming injustice and making justice, peace, and the integrity of creation more present in our local, national, and global realities. Today, moral theologians are more conscious of our responsibilities in this area of bringing about social change through more than just teaching what is right or wrong. Let me give a few examples. In my country, one example of this is the theological recognition of the role of community organizations who try to bring about change and greater justice in society. The United States claims to be a democracy, but a great number of people, maybe 40%, feel they have no power or role to play in society. They are truly passive. They do not participate or become involved, and in fact, they are estranged from the society. They have given up any possibility of bringing about justice and change and even improving their own situation. Community organizations attempt to organize the poor and the marginalized to show that by their organized efforts, they can bring about change and make justice more present. Community organization does not involve privileged people telling the underprivileged what to do. By definition, such organizations try to find the local leadership within a community and encourage that leadership to discern among the people themselves what are the primary problems of injustice they are facing, and to discern what are the best means to bring about change. Community organizers recognize that, especially in the beginning, it is very important for marginalized communities to have the experience that they can bring about change. Such small, successful attempts encourage them to continue and to move for bigger steps. Catholic theologians help to show concrete ways in which injustice can be overcome. One can readily see why Catholic social ethics should be concerned about the concrete ways of bringing about justice and overcoming sinful social structures. What is often been called personal ethics, such as bioethics, is usually distinguished from social ethics, and concerns itself with just the narrow confines of the discipline, that it's only interested in the personal and not in the social. Contemporary Catholic bioethics often engages in narrow ethical discourse. Is artificial hydration in these circumstances right or wrong? And policy discussions about what should be public policy on these issues. But this is only one sphere of social action open to theological and religious ethics. Heretofore, theological ethics has too readily conceded the playing field to those who define ethics in policy discourse, terms that are essentially the terms of liberal democratic personalism. Thus, Catholic bioethicists, by following the general approach in American bioethics, have forgotten about the equally or more important avenues of social reform. Catholic bioethics must also deal with practices and movements in civil society that can have a subversive and revolutionary impact on bioethics, science, and capitalism. The practice of medicine and the provision of health care in our American ethos are generally becoming scientific rather than humanistic enterprises and are primarily directed by marketplace values. Justice in medicine and access to procreative and therapeutic care are increasingly seen in terms of individual rights and liberties, with their emphasis on autonomy and informed consent. Theological bioethics, on the other hand, even when translated into secular terms and categories, should give priority to distributive justice, solidarity, the common good, and the preferential option for the poor. Participatory theological bioethics must turn its attention more firmly to social ethics and to political grassroots, mid-level, non-governmental, and governmental levels. My colleague and friend, Lisa Soley-Cahill, appreciatively describes the role of the Catholic Health Association in working on all these levels, as she has spearheaded this understanding of participatory bioethics. Another example, Brian Massengill's discussion of racism well illustrates the complex reality of racism and the difficulty in trying to change such structures of racism. The common sense understanding of racism sees racism as a personal act of rudeness, this is Brian speaking, hostility or discrimination, usually against persons of color. But an emphasis on personal attitudes and actions cannot explain the depth of the reality of racism. Massengill sees race as a cultural phenomenon involving a set of meanings and values that forms the life of a community. Culture provides the ideological foundation for social, political, and economic policies. Racism is a largely unconscious reality developed through cultural conditioning and instilled by socialization in a racist society. The culture of racism masks the indignities, discrimination, suspicion, and rejection that Black people experience just because of the color of their skin. They are not accepted in the same way as white people. White culture is an often unconscious awareness that accepts whiteness as the measure of what is real, standard, normative, and ideal. White privilege involves the uneven and unfair distribution of power, privilege, land, and material resources favoring us, white people. To be effective against racism, Catholic ethical reflection must adopt a structural and systemic approach, recognizing social evil as a cultural phenomenon of our underlying color symbol system that justifies race-based disparities. To overcome racism requires changing white privilege, white advantage, and white dominance. Massengill's understanding of racism provides a very clear understanding of the complexity and the depth of structural sin and the difficulties in trying to overcome it. Another example. In discussing immigration, Kristen Heyer recognizes that the best moral and political arguments in favor of the rights of immigrants are necessary but not sufficient. We are dealing here again with structural or social sin. Like Massengill, Heyer refers to this reality in the Laniganian term of scotosis. We need to recognize the unconscious dimension of social sin and the impact unjust structures have on moral agency. There is a dialectical relationship between personal and social sin. Social structures are both consequential and causal in nature. Persons help to create social structures by their action, but social structures of sin greatly influence human moral agency. Socioeconomic, cultural, and political structures opposed to immigration are connected to theological blindness, pride, insecurity, ignorance, and group egoism contribute to those structures opposed to hospitality to immigrants. Group egoism, to use Reinhold Niebuhr's phrase, contributes to cultural forces that elevate national or security concerns above moral ones, thus contributing to the rise of human rights violations and callous indifference to immigrants. These intertwined problems of social sin require repentance, conscientization, and radical conversion. The lens of individual culpability does not address the social sin of opposition to the human rights of immigrants. Racial solidarity is required to radical solidarity is required to reframe immigration as a shared international responsibility and to cultivate conversion from the existing pervasive ideologies. So that's the first point. It's not just enough to say this action is right or wrong. Most of them are complex, sinful social structures that can only be changed with an in-depth approach, attacking it from different angles, and will never totally succeed. The second point now, the human act must always be considered in relation to the person who places the act. Again, too often in the Catholic tradition, that the opposite was true. The manuals of moral theology gave little or no consideration to the need for a change in the person, with emphasis always on human actions alone and not on the person. And here, interestingly enough, there's a fascinating, the nice word is tension, the real word is probably incompatibility, between the older manuals of moral theology and the older manuals of dogmatic theology. The manuals of dogmatic theology defend the thesis that sinful human beings without grace are not able to observe over a long period of time the substance of the natural law. In other words, conversion or change of heart is necessary to live out the full requirements even of natural law. But interestingly enough, the manuals of moral theology paid no attention to this teaching found in the manuals of dogmatic theology. The Catholic tradition, as illustrated in the work of Thomas Aquinas, however, is much better. He recognized and even emphasized that acts must be seen in relation to the person and the virtues of the person. Aquinas, unfortunately in my country, part of the problem was that for the whole beginning of the 20th century until Vatican II, Aquinas was viewed as a philosopher and not as a theologian. And that again distorted the whole Thomistic approach. Aquinas developed what is today called moral theology. The term is not his. In the Prima Secundae of the Summa. The very last treatise in the Prima Secundae is Grace, questions 109 to 114. Bernard Herring taught me that back in 1959 at the Alfonsiana. Thank God for Bernard. Grace is necessary to do the works of Christian charity and love. Without grace, fallen human beings can do some good acts of the natural law, since sin does not totally destroy nature. But the human without grace is like the sick person who can do certain actions, but not all the same actions that the person in perfect health can do. In other words, even to do the works of the natural law easily and in its totality, the human person needs grace, or in the better biblical term, needs conversion. Thomas Aquinas is perhaps best known in many circles as for his teaching on natural law. But again, as most of you know, Aquinas devotes just one question in the Summa to natural law. Prima Secundae, question 94. Very few books on Aquinas have mentioned the new law, but the Summa has 3 questions on the new law. The new law, again, is not a written law, but rather it is primarily the gift of the Holy Spirit dwelling in our hearts. In addition to the role of grace and the new law, Aquinas spends most of the Prima Secundae on the role of virtues, which are the good habits disposing us to do what is right. Aquinas says the virtues modify the basic powers of the human person: intellect, will, concupiscible and irascible appetites. I prefer to see the virtues modifying the basic human relationships to God, neighbor, the world of creation, and self. Here too, with regard to the virtues, Aquinas sees the important role of the infused virtues, enabling the Christian to carry out the work, quote, supernatural works of charity. One does not have to agree with Thomistic anthropology to appreciate the importance for right actions of the human person to be transformed by grace and the infused virtues in order to live out the fullness of the Christian life. To its great credit, as we heard yesterday in a number of places, contemporary Catholic moral theology has insisted on the importance of the virtues, and not only for personal individual life, but for the social life of the human community. In my country, the greatest difference between Christian anthropology and the American ethos is the individualism that is so present in our society. Robert Bellah and his co-authors in a classic study described 2 kinds of individualism. Utilitarian individualism sees all other persons and things simply as means to achieve my own good. Expressive individualism insists on the need for the individual to be free in every moment of existence to express oneself in whatever way one wants to, with no consideration of others. According to this sociological study of Bella et al., the primary language, this is interesting, the primary language heard in the United States is the language of individualism. So strong and so pervasive is the individualistic ethos that even people who in their lives show great concern for others, the poor, and the common good, often only have the language of individualism to express what they are trying to do. They do not have any other way to describe their broader commitments to society and the needs of the poor and the marginalized. In opposition to such individualism, the Christian ethos insists on the common good, the solidarity of all creatures, human beings among themselves and with the environment, and the preferential option for the poor. The Catholic tradition today recognizes not only political and civil rights, such as the right to religion, speech, press, and assembly, but also social and economic rights, such as the right to food, clothing, shelter, education, and health care for all human beings. A major tragedy in the United States is the fact that we are the only highly developed country in the world without universal health care. Because justice in the United States is so often seen simply in terms of the relationship of one individual to another. But the Catholic tradition insists on distributive justice involving the relationship of society or the state to the individual, as seen, for example, in the just distribution of material goods in society, and legal or participative justice, which recognizes the relationship of the individual to society and the state, and that calls for an active participation of all in the life of society. Restorative justice, from the Christian perspective, aims at restoring the relationships in society that are so often and heavily broken by sin. Thus, from the perspective of Catholic moral theology, individuals striving to live out the love of God and neighbor, aided by the appropriate virtues, are basic to do the work of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. The role of the individual person is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient. Other actors are also required. And this brings up the third, and I must say the shortest part of my paper. The other actors involved are based on, very helpfully based, I think, on the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. The Catholic social tradition has developed the principle of subsidiarity, which serves as a guide for how to bring about change in society. The principle itself recognizes a very important but somewhat limited role of government in trying to ensure justice in society. However, between the individual and government are what others have called mediating institutions. The basic Catholic view of society looks something like this. At the very basis of society stands the human person with God-given dignity and rights. But the human person in relationships. The human person is prior to the state and cannot be subordinated to it. Next comes the family, the basic unity, the basic unit in society. On the next level are structures or institutions such as neighborhoods and extended families. We live in and through these realities. Then come independent structures and institutions that are necessary for any society. Think, for example, of the role of the press and the media. We're having a session on the press for the last session tomorrow afternoon. Or is it this afternoon? Think that cultural institutions of all kinds abound for the higher goods of the individual. Educational institutions exist to foster the education of all. Religious groups, mosques, synagogues, churches bring together people for religious purposes, with a recognition that religion has a role in working for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. Other groups that people freely join are called voluntary groups and play such an important role in our local, national, and global world. Think, for example, of Doctors Without Borders, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Habitat for Humanity. And then finally is the important but limited role of government. In issues of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, government has a significant role to play. Governments usually have laws against bribery and corruption. There are laws to protect the environment, to avoid disaster and climate change, although some presidents in some countries want to change them. There are also, many governments have mileage and emission standards for automobiles in order to protect the environment. In addition to laws and regulations, government can provide incentives to influence more people to work for social justice. The voluntary associations described in the principle of subsidiarity can promote a culture or ethos to support the work of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. Such an ethos plays an instrumental role in supporting existing governmental regulations, But such a culture also has an independent role to play in society. An ethos of honesty and transparency makes it easier for individuals to avoid the temptations of bribery and corruption. A culture of concern for the environment helps individual citizens to become more involved in the work of protecting and sustaining the environment. Voluntary recycling can help motivate others to follow the example and thus make their contribution to the good of the environment. Now then, what are the institutions in society that can help to bring about such a culture? Obviously, educational institutions have a big role to play in making society and individuals aware of the important needs of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. The free press can promote social justice and serve as a watchdog to point out the problems created by corruption. Religious groups contribute to such a culture by stimulating their adherents to become more involved in the work of justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. There can be different and at times even conflicting ways to carry out these policies. There might even be a few people opposed to some of these efforts, but they can and should be drowned out by the vast majority of people who seem willing to support these measures. A very important type of voluntary association that has come to the fore somewhat recently involves non-governmental organizations, NGOs. They have already had a significant effect in working for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation throughout the globe. So in conclusion then, I think at its best, the Catholic moral tradition has something to help us as we strive to deal with these problems. And I try to analyze that under three perspectives. First of all, it's important to recognize what acts are just and what acts are unjust, but it's not sufficient. We have to change the sinful structures that exist. Secondly, we have to consider more than actions, individual actions. We must also consider the individual moral agent who is converted and living in accord with the virtues. And third, we must recognize that the individual actor is not enough. We also require all the other actors in society that have been brought out, especially through the principle of subsidiarity. Thank you very much.
Sorry, excuse me, before the Q&A and the thanks, those of you who are living in the school here and who have opened your windows, can you please go and close them, because it's been raining heavily, and especially if you've those windows that are open on the top floor. Thanks.
We'll begin? Yeah. Okay. So thank you. And we thank you, Father Charles Karan, for the beautiful, enriching presentation. Now we have more than 25 minutes for discussion. But at the same time, we will have many questions, I am sure. So may I request you to tell your comments or questions very briefly so that more people can interact. So please.
I am Simon Mary Ayokai from Nigeria, but in the United States, working in the United States. Thank you, Charles. for your presentation. But I want to preface my question by first of all apologizing if what I'm going to, can you hear me? If what I'm going to say may come across as if I'm trivializing that tradition. That's not what I intend to do. I want to push further your insights. The tradition you talk about is still Eurocentric in many ways, in the language of the discourse, even in the insights, and even the content itself. And then, if we are going to, and the issues we face today in the world, be it racial issues, economic justice, and so on, violence in the world, if we go back to those traditions, there's always going to be a limitation of how much we can derive from that because it was cooked within a particular region and at a particular epoch, be it Christendom. So that said, I want to ask a general question. Has the time not come for Catholic ethical discourse be grounded in interreligious consciousness?
What kind of consciousness? Please?
Interreligious.
Oh, interreligious. Fine. Thank you very much, Simon. I agree very much with you. I think the reality is that what I've tried to do is just say where the tradition is today, the help that it might give. But the important reality now is to make that tradition incarnate in the global circumstances in which we live. There's no doubt that there's an important need for the ecumenical dimension. And quite frankly, more than the ecumenical. There's the need for the interreligious dimension, and there is the need for the broader human dimension right across the board. So again, I would agree with you, but I think the horizons have to be broader and more open even. But that's the challenge, I think, that belongs to the present generation of moral theologians. I speak from the old. I might be able to give some help to you in the process, but the challenge of your challenge is to creatively take the old and incarnate it in the new circumstances of time and place.
Yeah, Maureen Juncker-Kenny, Trinity College Dublin. Thanks a lot for this very helpful outline, which really gives us kind of the backdrop to what we need to do today. I was wondering whether you couldn't say more about the role of the state, the secular and neutral state, because I think giving just a limited role to government is not enough. The state is under so much pressure by international companies and by kind of all types of coalitions that I really think one has to say something more about democracy, about the people who in a specific country, not necessarily born there, vote, yeah, and therefore decide on the major political constitution. And we have various trends of populism and so on. So I think if from Catholic social teaching, all we can say there is a limited role to government, it doesn't deal enough, I think, with the diversity, with the role of the state to be neutral with regard to worldviews, but to enable them to put forward their views in the public sphere. So doesn't the Catholic social tradition have more to say about the positive role of the state? There are some people, radical orthodoxy and so on, who are just saying the state is kind of an instrument of war, nothing else. I think that's too negative, and you were not strong enough, I thought, on what a diverse state could do. Thanks.
No. Thank you very much for your comment. And perhaps I did, I was hurrying over a part there, and perhaps I did stress more the limits of the state. Again, the Catholic, to its credit in the past, has had a happy medium, I think, avoiding the dangers of totalitarianism on the one hand and individualism on the other. And I think that all the way through for the future, too, we try to find that road to hoe. Again, even in my country, I worry that there's too much individualism going around. In my country, I argue that state has a much better role to play. You know, people say, you hear it so often, get the state off my back. You know, I never heard anybody say that when they were getting on an airplane. You know, they're glad to have somebody inspecting those airplanes, who isn't only in the business of making money. So just as a practical example, I think that I might have so stressed the limited role, but I tried to balance it by pointing out the dangers of individualism. So as I see it, they're the twofold realities of avoiding totalitarianism and avoiding individualism.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am Nontando from St. Augustine College in Johannesburg. I want to just raise two problems that about ethics, because it seems to be something that is practiced by people with agency and power. Because when we look at the people that are the marginalized that we talk about, who have to survive, they have to cross borders and while you are crossing those borders, you are disrupting the ethical, you're not being honest, but you have to survive. So even, you know, so you find that the disruption of ethics becomes a survival mechanisms for those that don't have the agency or the power. You find a woman who is being violated in the home, disrupting the home and moving out with her children. And so I think our whole understanding, and we saw that in the struggle against AIDS, when there was the assumption that people can make decisions, that you can be faithful, you can abstain, and only to realize that those kind of ethics assume agency that the marginalized majority simply don't have. So they have to lie in order to cross the border, in order to feed their children. So when we say that something is a lie, we say it from a position of power and privilege, but for those that to survive itself requires the disruption of ethics. And I just really would like us to really think about that. You know, instead of saying now we are solidarity with the marginalized and then imposing a structure that doesn't result in their survival, but the disruption of ethics. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think I have argued in the past that one of the deficiencies in Catholic social ethics has been its failure to deal with power. And I think we all have to do more in that line. But power I want to see in two ways. The negative aspect of power is power over, the power of domination. But the other aspect of power is empowerment, to empower the poor, the marginalized, and those who have less. And I think that, you know, that is the aspect of power that is so important and so significant today. But again, we recognize that the sinful situations in which this exists are so strong that, you know, and maybe at the present time, the only way people can fight against it is by lying, cheating, etc., kind of thing. And I think the Catholic tradition in the past would say, go for it. But the bigger issue is the future, and I think we have to change those structures so that we can empower those who today are powerless.
Robert Gascoigne, Australia. Charles, thank you very much for your analysis. I want to ask about political structures. And you've noted the various structures in the community and the state. I want to ask about global political structures, in particular the United Nations, and thinking of where we are here in Sarajevo, how the UN was relatively helpless and was only the intervention of NATO that ended the siege. I wonder if you'd care to comment on how you see the future of global political institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. in some ways, I think that remains one of the biggest issues that we have. Now, you see, what little bit I've read about Sarajevo, even the solution that the UN and the US imposed at Dayton was not the most just solution to the problem. But at least it was better than nothing. And at the very minimum, as you indicate, we're living in a global world that therefore the great dangers of nationalism, the great dangers of any one religion absolutizing itself are going to be perennial dangers that have to be overcome. It seemed to me, I did a little reading before I came here, and I was, some of you people are much more expert than I, but let me explain my little bit of knowledge and then you can correct me. What I read about this country was the period of where there was the greatest possibility of working together in peace and cooperation was the Ottoman Empire. The Muslims, those people whom in my country we castigate all over the place today, huh? But as I walked around the old town here, I don't think there's another place in the world where you can see a mosque, a synagogue, and a Christian church right next door to one another. And to that, I admire what I learned here. It shows that you can, those divisions that have become so strong, so prevalent in our Western world, and here, going back to, I think, to the origins in the Ottoman Empire, there was this opportunity here to live in peace and harmony with one another. Now, so the danger of nationalism is very strong, and therefore we have to be very, very conscious of that. If we have a relational responsibility, very, very frankly, I get all upset with the leaders of my own country now who talk about, we got to make America great again. No, we don't. We got to make America work better with all the world for the good of everybody and not simply for the good of America. And that's probably a cheap shot. I don't imagine there are many people who would disagree with that. But anyhow, I felt I had to make it. But then, the bigger issue then comes. Will it ever be possible to have a global society? In a sense, I think I'm not the person to give a very well thought out approach to that. It's going to be very difficult. But and maybe it's not a good thing in the end because it would denigrate the local, cultures, the local aspects, etc. The danger we face is the danger of absolutizing what is just local, whether it's the local church, whatever the church is, the local institutions, etc. But we have to, at the very minimum, I think, we can begin to form some kind of international structures that strive to bring about a greater global awareness and a greater global recognition of the need to help one another. And again, I think what's happened in the Doctors Without Borders is just a good illustration of that. I think from what I've read, others who have done the work there, not I, the work that has been done to help overcome the pandemic of HIV/AIDS. So I think there are, at the very minimum, I think we can all admit we're not going to have a universal global world structure certainly in my lifetime and in your lifetime, Robert. But in the meantime, maybe we have to try to come up with other instrumentalities that strive in a better way to recognize the global world in which we live.
Thank you very much for a really interesting and sustaining paper. I love what you say about we've got all the language in our theology. We know what's right, but how do we actually get down into the messy world and do it? Now, we do have one single global culture that's one of the world's most ancient cultures, and that's our church. And I want to say that unless we acknowledge that gender politics is the politics of our time, everything else we're saying is going to be ineffective, because still, as women from every culture, I'm Tina Beattie from London, should have said that, including Brexit, Britain and Trump's America, women are in danger of losing the fragile gains we've made. And for my sisters from the Global South, they fight harder than any of us for those gains that often have yet to be made. But we belong to the biggest masculine androcentric culture in the world. So if we are going to translate our rhetoric into action, I want to give an invitation to every man here. Whatever you are invited to as a Catholic man, say, not without my sisters. If you're invited to a conference, who are the women who are speaking? Don't go if there are no women. If you're invited to a synod of bishops, don't go unless you can take your sister with you as an advisor. So let's put flesh on our rhetoric.
Thank you, Tina. I obviously agree very much with you. And maybe that should have been a topic that we addressed. Now, the problem is you can't address all topics. But as you say, that is a major topic in the world, and it's a huge topic for the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the role of women in the Roman Catholic Church is horrible. And I have always striven to do everything I can to encourage women in the church. I'm not sure I could stay in this church if I were a woman. So thank you for doing so.
I'm Paulachan from Dharmaram Vidyakshetram, Bangalore, India. I'm very happy to have your paper, which is having a very good clarity and compelling arguments. And I thank you very specially for what you have expressed on three important aspects of justice, peace, and integrity of creation on the basis of our tradition, Catholic tradition. But my humble observation at this moment is, shall we not go beyond or behind this theological tradition to the biblical tradition, where we have that covenant consciousness, where we have the land, the Lord, and people, where we will have this integrity of creation, justice, and peace, which is the horizon in which the whole of the Bible is about. Because that's where we have the sacred scripture, is the starting point. Shall we not consider that also as part of our tradition, which will build bridges with the other churches and also people of other faiths, than just confining to our so-called theological tradition, beginning with St. Thomas Aquinas, who is a giant theologian, of course. Thank you.
I think there's a lot of room in the world that goes beyond dead white theologians. And I appreciate your comments very much. Interesting, the concept that I used of justice, peace, and integrity of creation is a broader context than just the Catholic tradition. But I think it's important for us then, again, in the very diverse local circumstances of culture, politics, economics, etc., to be able to understand what Vatican II called the signs of the times, to dialogue with the signs of the time in our own environment, in our own time. this doesn't deny that there are such things as universal realities. I think the point that Tina Beatty made a few minutes ago was very good about the role of women in all cultures. But on the other hand, there are also specific individual realities in particular cultures that raise particular issues and problems.
Hello, Anthony Egan from South Africa. I'd like to talk about the practicalities of resistance politics. And I'm talking from the experience of the last 2 years with the battle to get rid of Jacob Zuma, or who was, in a sense, just a focus of a greater malaise in South Africa, the violation of our constitution and the undermining of democracy economically, socially, politically, and on a cultural level by corruption. And this resistance was conducted alliance of, let me give you an example. One of the key figures was a Hindu former communist. The other was a Muslim communist married to a Catholic. The other was the Episcopal Archbishop. And there were a whole range of people from all different backgrounds. And what I think is interesting about your talk, as I was listening to it, was that it resonates well. Aquinas, the philosopher, paradoxically, is the sort of source we can all use, and all our different traditions can resonate with him. And I got a sense in the last few years that's precisely what happened. And do you think that is an example of what we can do, perhaps when we work beyond narrow confessional boundaries?
Okay, I appreciate that, Anthony. Could I ask you a question? Would you see a role for violence in trying to bring about justice in a situation such as you described?
Well, I think, we were lucky in the sense that it didn't get to that stage. But look, I have in the past said quite clearly that I understand the need for force. But it didn't reach that stage. And in a sense, what we were doing, we were saying, we have to defend the Constitution. We have to call the leaders to account. And the interesting point was that those who led the opposition were from within the very ruling party that Jacob Zuma subverted. Does it help?
No. All right, I appreciate that. I think, again, I see somewhat an analogous situation with my own country and the Constitution. Again, constitutions are limited documents. They show the limitations of time and space. Or other documents, like the Declaration of Independence in my country, that if you can say that all are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And now, in my country, well, black people didn't have any rights. The founders of our country had slaves. The women had no rights, couldn't vote until about 100 years ago. But at least it was helpful to be able to have those words that you could appeal to, that all are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And therefore, I think, at least, again, all I can speak of is out of my own experience. But I think that was well illustrated in the work of Martin Luther King. I mean, Martin Luther King is a good example, I think, of how to try to change structures in society. And again, you want to be as broad as possible. But also, he spoke from the Christian tradition. But he recognized the need to use both. And I think he did as good a job doing that as others have done. That you can appeal both to the Declaration and to the gospel kind of thing. And in that way, if you're going to try to change, you're ultimately, you can't just change if you're Catholics alone or Christians alone. You've got to be able to have the broad human support. And to get that broad human support, you've got to do more than quote the gospel. you've got to be able to work with all people of goodwill in the process. And I mean, again, it's not an easy process, but I think it's, at least it's, I'm not sure it's the only way. I don't think it is, but it's one way that maybe we could go forward with.
Charlie? Tobias Wainwright, St. Louis University. Speaking of analogy, speaking of subsidiarity and mediating associations, we are one such entity. We are educators, we are part of the church, and your reference to Doctors Without Borders, I kind of think of us as ethicists without borders, Catholic ethicists without borders. And more than education, this ties in with our previous session, actually, our examine. It seems like many of us feel like we are educating, we are trying to educate church students, whatever, but we are about more than that, sort of like Doctors Without Borders, like an NGO in a way. And I just wonder if you might tease out, like, moral theology, theological ethics today, that seems to be something that is more of a characteristic of many people here than in the past.
Did you say more present than it was in the past, Toby? Is that how you ended it? Yeah. Yes, right, right. No, I would basically agree with that. I mean, you know, we have all, and thanks for this group that's been met in Padua, Trento, and now here, I've become much more conscious of the world church than I was 30 years ago. And what I did know of the world church 30 years ago was something that came from the top down. And the universality of it was that we all celebrated the liturgy in Latin. I mean, we had no room for individual diversity. We had no room for local cultures. But that's the tension. And in a certain sense, then, I think, you know, and again, it's easy to describe this theoretically, but it's very difficult to bring out in practice. How do you recognize the legitimate diversities and differences, and yet continue to push people's boundaries beyond these, to keep them from absolutizing what is finite, to open their horizons, to ultimately be able to see things in the broadest possible perspective? And maybe, Toby, that's one of our responsibilities as moral theologians. If we can get people to, I mean, you know, education itself is that. We try to open up people's minds, we say. Huh? We try to keep them be constantly learning, to keep ourselves constantly learning, to have the intellectual curiosity that asks us, who continues to raise the question of why, how, where. And these are so important. But again, not just on the individual personal level, but now to go open our eyes to realize there are other economic structures, there are other political structures that might be better, there are other cultural appreciations that might be important that we can all learn from. And it seems to me that, you know, maybe we who have been, like myself, have benefited from the 3 conferences that our group has put together. By the way, I was wondering if we ought to change the name of our group too. I think it might almost appropriately be called the Catholic Theological Ethics in a World Church based at Boston College. But
the World Church,
to its great credit, it transcends Boston College.
Could I just say, on that note, could I just ask how many are graduates of the Alfonsianum here? Could you raise your hand? How many are graduates of the Alfonsianum? Could I ask how many are graduates of the Gregorian? Then could I ask how many are graduates of Notre Dame? How many are graduates of Boston College? There's several institutions here that have a claim on this organization. We would like to see Notre Dame more involved. We would like to see a lot of the other schools. Yeah, Paulinus, you're here, and Tobias is here. But I'm just saying that it's not just Boston College. It's the Alfonsiaman, it's the Greg, it could be Comillas, it could be the Ateneo, it could be, how many are connected to Damarum? How many? Yeah. So there's a lot more from Damarum than other institutions in the United States. It's a very diverse crowd.
How could I disagree with my friend Jim? But again, in tribute to Jim, these 3 meetings would never have taken place if it weren't for Boston College.
Is it working? Yes. Gregor Buss, currently at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I have a general question on our field, Catholic ethics. I very much enjoyed how you brought the personal and the social level together, that we can't distinguish between these two, actually, in our ethical reflections. So my question is it still up to date to differentiate so clearly between Christian social ethics and moral theology? Or should we go more to a combined approach of, I don't know, theological ethics? And if not, what are the benefits of keeping these two disciplines apart? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, again, that has been a danger where we have seen personal ethics in one hand and social ethics in another. To me, one of the worst aspects of the two is our own Roman Catholic tradition. I mean, frankly, a lot of our personal ethics I have all sorts of problems with. But our social ethics has always been much better. And I think we would be much better off if our personal and ethics, and especially our sexual ethics, learned something from our social ethics. That we could learn from social ethics the importance of historical consciousness, the importance of change, the importance of a relationality understanding of things that would do so much to improve our personal and especially our sexual ethics. So that I think that's just, to me, an illustration even of our own narrow Catholic tradition, that we'd be much better off if we could get away from the compartmentalization of personal here and social there. And I think, as I say, I think we're beginning to do that. I see people already moving in that direction, and I would hope that it could continue. But we have tended to see it. Perhaps, well, again, part of the problem came, the manuals of moral theology were primarily personal. And therefore, in fairness, you had this other aspect grow up of Catholic social teaching. I mean, my friend Antonio here can tell us, in the German universities, you got 2 chairs. You got the social ethics chair and the moral theology chair. And again, I mean, that's just how these things grew up. But the danger then that we have, as I say, it seems to me, is that we've got to try to bring them together. So I would agree totally with you that we've got to, there's no, I mean, the feminists told us that the personal is political.
Nobody feels hungry, it seems, but it is almost time. We will have only one more question. Thank you.
So and picking up from where you just left, Teresia Hinga, I'm here. Teresia Hinga from Kenya, but also from Santa Clara University. And picking up from where you just left, you mentioned that feminists have contributed to the thinking about ethics. And one of the insights that feminist analysts and ethicists have contributed pertains to the whole question of systemic sin and what you described as social sin. They have identified power as domination as a root cause of many of the ethical crises that we have. the further insight, though, is that these systemic systems of domination, or kyriarchies, as some of us refer to them, do not work in isolation. Rather, they work in a way that multiplies and in a multiplicative and cumulative effect on the people that are affected. And so racism, sexism, colonialism sometimes converge, particularly on the backs of women, to create sometimes a lethal dose of injustice. So how can our ethics recognize that nexus and intersectionality of the systems of domination? And the second quick question is, historical injustices, much of what we are experiencing today is rooted in history of slavery, of colonialism. Thank you.
I didn't understand everything you said. Again, it seemed to me that the challenge you gave me is the challenge I'll give back to you. It's up to you people to do this in your circumstances and in your place. I really can't do it.
Thank you, Father Charles Karan, for showing his examples. Okay. And thank you all for the lively discussion and interventions. So now, just 1 minute more. There is an announcement, so over to Christine. Thank you.
I just want to join Shaji in thanking Charles Curran for his remarks today, his taking a lot of conversation. Not only your corpus of scholarship, Charlie, but you have embodied the virtue many have called for over your career. Shaji called it creative fidelity. I would add bold candor, as we heard yesterday, and for your hospitable mentorship, really, of new generations of scholars. One quick word about the concurrent sessions, which will begin directly after lunch, as you know. First of all, due to a couple of last-minute cancellations with visa issues, can I remind conveners and speakers to have speaker number 1 for 15 minutes, discussion for 15 minutes, speaker number 2 for 15 minutes, discussion, so that if there's only one speaker, you can feel free to go to another. And I can also thank you for your flexibility in rearranging rooms that are being used for small groups as well today. Please end on time so we can go to the coffee break and then meet back here at 1600 at 4 o'clock for the day's final plenary. Thank you again.